Imagine a school where the security cameras malfunction in the exact hallway where a girl is beaten into a coma, where the children of the wealthiest families record everything on their phones, and the next day, every single piece of evidence vanishes as if it never existed. Now tell me, how is it possible that a defenseless girl ends up fighting for her life while her attackers keep smiling in the hallways, untouchable? And the most disturbing part, this wasn't an accident. It was planned. The fluorescent lights of Westfield Academy buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting their harsh white glare across polished marble floors that reflected the carefully curated image of privilege. But beneath that gleaming surface lay something rotten, a darkness that money and influence had spent years burying. They thought they could silence a gentle girl's scream with the weight of their wallets. They thought they could bury the truth in paperwork and legal maneuvering. They had no idea what her father was capable of when everything he loved was taken from him. Emily Chen had always been invisible in the way that gentle souls often are, not because she lacked substance, but because she moved through the world with such quiet grace that others barely noticed her presence. At 17, she possessed the kind of understated beauty that came from authenticity rather than artifice. Her dark hair fell in soft waves around a face unmarked by the cynicism that seemed to plague so many of her peers at Westfield Academy. While other students adorned themselves with designer labels and calculated social media personas, Emily found her identity in the stroke of a paintbrush and the whispered conversations she shared with the few friends who truly saw her. The private academy sat like a monument to wealth on the outskirts of the city, its red brick facade and ivy-covered walls speaking to generations of privilege and entitlement. Manicured lawns stretched between buildings that housed state-of-the-art facilities, funded by donations from families whose names graced corporate boardrooms and political campaigns. This was where the elite sent their children to network before they'd even learned to drive, where a student's worth was measured not by their character, but by their parents' net worth. Emily didn't belong to this world by birthright. Her father, Daniel Chen, had scraped and saved to send her here, working double shifts as a construction foreman to afford tuition that would have fed a small family for months. He believed, with the naive hope that only a parent can possess, that surrounding his daughter with opportunity would somehow shield her from the cruelties of the world. He couldn't have known that he was delivering her directly into the hands of predators who saw her difference not as something to celebrate, but as weakness to exploit. The harassment had started subtly, as these things often do. Whispered comments about her second-hand clothes, deliberate exclusion from study groups, the kind of social exile that teenagers wield like a weapon. Emily had tried to hide it from her father, painting on smiles during their evening conversations while she helped him with paperwork at their small kitchen table. She knew how hard he worked to give her this chance, knew the sacrifices he made every day. The last thing she wanted was to burden him with her problems. But Madison Sinclair and her circle of friends, if you could call accomplices friends, saw Emily's silence as permission to escalate. Madison, with her platinum blonde hair styled to perfection and her uniform tailored to accentuate every advantage money could buy, ruled Westfield's social hierarchy with the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced consequences for her actions. Her father owned half the city's commercial real estate. Her mother chaired the school's board of trustees, and their combined influence had turned the academy into their personal kingdom. Beside her stood Trevor Hawthorne, all sharp jawlines and inherited arrogance, whose pharmaceutical fortune had purchased him a reputation as untouchable. Jessica Walsh completed their trinity of malice, her family's media empire ensuring that any stories that might damage their circle never saw the light of day. Together, they had perfected the art of psychological warfare, knowing exactly how far they could push before crossing lines that even their parents' money couldn't erase. Emily's art had become her refuge, those precious hours in the studio where color and form could express what words never could. She painted landscapes that spoke of longing for spaces where beauty wasn't purchased but discovered, portraits that captured the humanity others chose to ignore. Her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, often stayed after hours to provide the encouragement Emily couldn't find elsewhere, seeing in the girl's work a depth that her tormentors would never possess. "Your technique is developing beautifully," Mrs. Rodriguez had said just days before everything changed, studying Emily's latest canvas, a haunting piece that seemed to predict its creator's fate. "But more than that, you're learning to put truth on canvas. That's what separates real artists from people who just know how to use a brush." Emily had smiled at the praise, unaware that Madison and her friends had been listening from the hallway, their faces twisting with the particular rage that comes when someone you've dismissed as worthless receives recognition you believe should belong to you. The morning of October 15th dawned grey and cold, autumn pressing against the windows of Westfield Academy like a warning of things to come. Emily arrived early, as was her habit, hoping to steal a few quiet moments in the art studio before the chaos of another school day began. She moved through the corridors with her usual careful grace, her worn backpack slung over one shoulder, completely unaware that she was walking into a trap months in the making. Madison had spent weeks planning what she called putting the scholarship girl in her place. The location was perfect, a section of hallway near the old gymnasium where security cameras had convenient blind spots, where the sound of footsteps would be muffled by thick walls and distant machinery. She'd enlisted not just her usual accomplices, but a wider circle of students, each one eager to prove their loyalty to the queen bee who controlled their social standing. The attack began with what seemed like an accident. Emily was walking past the cluster of students when someone's foot shot out, sending her sprawling across the polished floor. Her art supplies scattered in a cascade of pencils and paintbrushes, her carefully protected portfolio sliding across the marble like a wounded bird. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," Madison said, her voice dripping with false concern as Emily struggled to gather her scattered belongings. "I didn't see you there. You're so small." The laughter that followed had a predatory edge, the sound of a pack that had scented blood. Emily's cheeks burned as she scrambled to collect her things, her hands shaking not from embarrassment, but from a growing awareness that this was about to become something much worse. "Actually," Madison continued, her tone shifting from mock concern to open malice, "maybe it's time someone taught you where you really belong." The first push was almost gentle, barely enough to make Emily stumble, but it was a signal, a green light that sent ripples through the watching crowd. What happened next unfolded with the terrible momentum of an avalanche, each act of violence building on the last until it became something monstrous. Hands shoved her from multiple directions. Voices hurled words designed to cut deeper than any blade. Someone grabbed her portfolio and tore it open, sending months of careful work fluttering to the floor like fallen leaves. Emily's paintings were stepped on, torn, destroyed with a casual cruelty that revealed just how little these privileged children valued anything they couldn't own or control. "Please stop," Emily whispered, the words barely audible above the growing chaos. "Please, I didn't do anything." But her pleas only seemed to fuel their rage. Trevor stepped forward, his expensive sneakers grinding one of her paintings into the marble. "That's the problem with people like you," he snarled. "You think you deserve to be here. You think your little charity scholarship makes you one of us." The violence escalated with terrifying speed. What had started as psychological torture became physical assault as the mob mentality took hold. Emily found herself surrounded by a circle of faces, twisted with the kind of rage that comes from years of getting everything they wanted, except the one thing money can't buy: genuine respect. The blows came from everywhere at once. Fists and feet and the sharp edges of designer accessories became weapons in the hands of children who had never learned that actions have consequences. Emily curled into herself, trying to protect her head as the assault intensified, her quiet sobs lost beneath the sounds of violence and cruelty. Phone cameras captured every moment, recording the destruction of an innocent girl with the same casual interest they might show for a viral dance trend. The footage was clear, undeniable evidence of a brutal assault that would haunt its viewers and condemn its perpetrators if it ever saw the light of day. The attack might have continued until something irreversible occurred, but the sound of approaching footsteps sent the mob scattering like roaches when a light is turned on. They left Emily crumpled on the floor, her art destroyed around her, her body broken, and her spirit shattered. Blood pooled beneath her head where it had struck the marble, mixing with the watercolors from her destroyed paintings in a grotesque parody of the art she loved. Mrs. Rodriguez found her there 20 minutes later, alerted by the scattered art supplies and the unnatural silence in a hallway that should have been filled with the morning bustle of arriving students. The teacher's scream echoed through the corridors, a sound of pure anguish that would haunt the school's halls long after the blood was cleaned from its floors. The paramedics arrived to find Emily unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular, her pulse weak but persistent. They worked with the efficiency of professionals who had seen too much trauma, their movements precise and urgent as they fought to stabilize a girl whose only crime had been existing in a space where she wasn't wanted. As the ambulance pulled away from Westfield Academy, its sirens wailing a song of emergency and desperation, the school's administration was already mobilizing a different kind of response. Phone calls were made to lawyers and public relations firms, conversations held in hushed tones behind closed doors, wheels set in motion to protect the institution and its most valuable students from the consequences of their actions. But in that sterile hospital room, where Emily lay fighting for her life, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed their electronic songs of survival, none of those calculations mattered. What mattered was the broken girl in the bed and the father who was about to discover that sometimes the only justice available is the kind you create yourself. The call came while Daniel Chen was 40 feet above the ground, his hard hat catching the afternoon sun as he guided steel beams into place with the precision of someone who had spent his life building things meant to last. The construction site buzzed with the controlled chaos of a major project, the sounds of machinery and shouted instructions creating a symphony of honest work that had defined his world since leaving the Marines 15 years ago. When his phone rang, Daniel almost didn't answer. He was in the middle of a delicate operation, and the margin for error when working with several tons of steel was essentially zero. But something about the persistent buzzing made him signal for a halt, climbing down from the beam with the careful movements of a man who knew that one mistake could be his last. "Mr. Chen." The voice was female, professional, but with an underlying tension that made his stomach clench. "This is Sarah Martinez from St. Mary's Hospital. I'm calling about your daughter, Emily." The world went very quiet around Daniel. The construction noise faded to a distant hum, his fellow workers becoming background figures in a scene that suddenly felt unreal. He had been a soldier once, trained to process information quickly and react under pressure, but nothing had prepared him for the way those words seemed to stop time itself. "What happened to my daughter?" His voice was steady, controlled, but his free hand was already reaching for his car keys. "She's been brought in with severe head trauma." The nurse continued, her professional calm barely masking the gravity of the situation. "You need to get here as soon as possible, Mr. Chen. The doctors need to speak with you immediately." Daniel didn't remember the drive to the hospital, though later he would learn that several traffic cameras had captured his pickup truck, running red lights at dangerous speeds. His military training kicked in, flooding his system with the kind of focused calm that had kept him alive in Afghanistan, but felt completely inadequate for this new kind of battlefield. St. Mary's Hospital was a sprawling complex of glass and steel, its emergency entrance marked by the constant flow of ambulances and the quiet desperation of families in crisis. Daniel burst through the automatic doors like a man possessed, his work clothes and dust-covered boots marking him as different from the other visitors in their careful civilian attire. "Emily Chen," he said to the receptionist, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm her father. Where is she?" The woman behind the desk looked up from her computer screen, her eyes taking in his appearance with the practiced assessment of someone who had learned to read crisis in the faces of loved ones. "Third floor, ICU. Take the elevator to your left. The nurses' station will direct you from there." The elevator ride lasted an eternity, each floor marking another step toward a reality Daniel wasn't prepared to face. He had seen violence before, had held dying comrades in his arms, and learned to compartmentalize trauma in ways that let him function when others would crumble. But this was Emily, his daughter, his reason for every sacrifice he had made since leaving the military. Dr. Patricia Williams was waiting for him when the elevator doors opened, her scrubs stained with what Daniel's experienced eye immediately recognized as his daughter's blood. She was a woman in her 50s, with the kind of steady competence that came from years of delivering news that no parent should ever have to hear. "Mr. Chen, I'm Dr. Williams, the attending physician." She extended her hand, but Daniel barely registered the gesture. "Let's talk in private." They walked to a small conference room that smelled of industrial disinfectant and barely contained grief. Through the window, Daniel could see into the ICU, where machines surrounded a small figure that looked impossibly fragile beneath the harsh fluorescent lighting. "Your daughter has suffered severe cranial trauma," Dr. Williams began, her voice gentle but direct. "The CT scans show significant swelling in her brain, and we've had to induce a medically necessary coma to reduce the pressure. The next 48 hours will be critical." Daniel stared through the window at Emily's still form, her face barely visible beneath the network of tubes and monitors that were keeping her alive. This was the girl who had painted him pictures of the Afghanistan mountains he'd described to her, who stayed up late helping him with construction estimates because she understood math better than he ever would, who kissed his cheek every morning before school and told him she loved him with the unself-conscious affection of a daughter who had never doubted her father's devotion. "What happened to her?" His question was simple, but Dr. Williams's hesitation spoke volumes. "According to the school, there was an incident in one of the hallways, some kind of altercation between students that got out of hand." She was choosing her words carefully, Daniel realized, speaking like someone who had been coached on what to say and what to leave unsaid. An altercation. Daniel's voice was flat, empty of emotion, in a way that anyone who had served with him would have recognized as dangerous. "My daughter weighs 110 pounds and has never been in a fight in her life. What kind of altercation puts a girl like that in a coma?" Dr. Williams looked uncomfortable, her eyes sliding away from his direct gaze. "The school administration is handling the investigation. They've assured us that they're taking the matter very seriously." It was then that Daniel realized the first piece of the puzzle that would consume his life for the next several months. The doctor wasn't just uncomfortable, she was scared. Not of him, but of something else. Some pressure that was being applied from directions he couldn't yet see. "I want to see her," he said simply. The ICU was a place of quiet efficiency, where machines breathed for patients who couldn't breathe for themselves, and monitors tracked the thin line between life and death with electronic precision. Emily lay in the center of it all, looking impossibly small beneath the white sheets, her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. Daniel pulled a chair close to her bedside and took her hand in his, careful not to disturb the IV lines that snaked across her pale skin. Her fingers were cold, too cold, and when he squeezed gently, there was no response, no sign that she knew he was there. "I'm here, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "Daddy's here, and I'm not going anywhere." He stayed there for hours, holding her hand and talking to her about everything and nothing. He told her about the building project he was working on, about the promotion he'd been offered that would mean better benefits and college money for her future. He told her about the art supplies he'd been secretly buying for her birthday, the easel he'd been building in the garage when she wasn't home. But as the evening wore on and visiting hours ended, Daniel found himself studying his daughter's injuries with the clinical eye of someone who had seen violence up close. The bruising on her face wasn't consistent with a simple fall or even a single blow. The pattern of injuries spoke of sustained assault, of multiple attackers, of the kind of coordinated brutality that didn't happen by accident. When the night nurse gently suggested he should go home and rest, Daniel nodded and gathered his things. But he didn't go home. Instead, he sat in his truck in the hospital parking lot, staring up at the window where his daughter lay unconscious, and began to plan. He had been a Marine once, trained in reconnaissance and intelligence gathering, skilled in the art of warfare, both conventional and unconventional. Those skills had been dormant for years, buried beneath the routine of civilian life and the responsibilities of single parenthood. But as he sat in that parking lot, watching the hospital lights blur through tears he couldn't quite suppress, Daniel felt something awakening in him that had been sleeping since he'd hung up his uniform. The next morning brought a parade of visitors to the ICU, each one carrying messages of concern and support that felt increasingly hollow as Daniel began to recognize the patterns beneath their words. The school's principal, Dr. Margaret Ashford, arrived first, her perfectly styled silver hair and designer suit marking her as someone more comfortable in boardrooms than beside hospital beds. "Mr. Chen, I cannot express how sorry we are about this tragic incident," she began, her voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone who had delivered similar speeches before. "Please know that Westfield Academy is committed to getting to the bottom of this situation." Daniel studied her face as she spoke, noting the way her eyes never quite met his, the carefully neutral expression that revealed nothing while promising everything. "What exactly happened to my daughter, Dr. Ashford?" "Well, as I'm sure you can understand, we're still investigating the details," she replied smoothly. "What we do know is that there was some kind of disagreement between students that unfortunately escalated. These things happen sometimes, particularly with young people who are still learning to manage their emotions." The way she said it made Emily's brutal assault sound like nothing more than a playground scuffle, a minor disagreement between equals rather than the coordinated attack Daniel was beginning to understand it had been. But he kept his expression neutral, filing away her words for later consideration. "I'd like to see the security footage," he said simply. Dr. Ashford's perfectly composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that looked almost like panic before she regained her composure. "I'm afraid that's not possible at this time. The footage is part of an ongoing investigation, and we need to respect the privacy of all our students, including the ones who put my daughter in a coma. Mr. Chen, I understand you're upset, and rightfully so, but I need to caution you about making accusations when we don't yet have all the facts." Her tone had shifted subtly, from sympathy to something that sounded almost like a threat. "Westfield Academy has an excellent reputation, and we've worked very hard to create an environment where all our students can thrive. Sometimes misunderstandings occur, but we're confident that once we have all the information, we'll be able to resolve this situation in a way that's beneficial for everyone involved." Daniel felt a cold clarity settle over him as he listened to her carefully crafted non-answers. This woman wasn't here to seek justice for Emily or to ensure that her attackers faced consequences. She was here to manage a crisis, to protect the school's reputation and the interests of whoever had enough power to make her dance to their tune. "I see," he said quietly. "And how long do you expect this investigation to take?" "These things can be complex, Mr. Chen. We want to be thorough to make sure we get it right. I'm sure you understand the importance of due process." After she left, trailing promises of updates and assurances that felt as substantial as morning mist, Daniel remained beside Emily's bed and began to understand the true scope of what he was facing. This wasn't just about finding out who had hurt his daughter. It was about confronting a system designed to protect the guilty when they had enough money and influence to buy their way out of consequences. The second visitor arrived that afternoon. Detective Ray Morrison, a tired-looking man in his 40s, whose rumpled suit and weary expression spoke of too many cases and too little hope. He carried himself with the defeated air of someone who had learned not to expect too much from a system that consistently disappointed him. "Mr. Chen, I'm Detective Morrison, investigating the incident at your daughter's school." He settled into the chair beside Emily's bed with a heavy sigh. "I wanted to update you on where we stand." Daniel waited, watching the detective's face for clues about what he was really here to say. "We've interviewed several students who were in the area when the incident occurred," Morrison continued, his voice carrying the monotone of someone reading from a script. "Unfortunately, the accounts are somewhat inconsistent. It appears there was some kind of altercation, but the exact details are unclear." "Inconsistent how?" Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Well, some students say they didn't see anything, others claimed they were too far away to be sure what happened. It's proving difficult to establish a clear timeline of events." Daniel had interrogated enough prisoners of war to recognize when someone was being evasive. What about the security cameras? Surely they captured something. "That's complicated." Morrison's discomfort was becoming more obvious by the minute. "There seems to have been some kind of technical malfunction with the cameras in that particular area. The footage is corrupted, unusable. How convenient. Look, Mr. Chen, I understand your frustration, I really do. But without clear evidence or reliable witnesses, it's very difficult to build a case. These kids, they all lawyer up the minute we try to talk to them, and their parents have connections that make our job challenging." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice remaining calm despite the rage building in his chest. "Are you telling me that no one is going to be held responsible for what happened to my daughter?" Morrison had the grace to look ashamed. "I'm saying that the system has limitations, especially when we're dealing with influential families. Sometimes, the best we can hope for is that the school takes appropriate disciplinary action." After the detective left with more empty promises and bureaucratic excuses, Daniel sat alone with his unconscious daughter and felt something fundamental shift inside him. He had served his country with the naive belief that justice was more than just a word, that there were systems in place to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. He had been wrong then, and he was being proven wrong again now. But this time was different. This time, it was personal. That evening, Daniel made a decision that would reshape everything that followed. He wouldn't wait for the system to deliver justice, because the system was clearly designed to protect everyone, except people like Emily. He wouldn't trust in authorities who seemed more interested in managing public perception than finding the truth. Instead, he would do what Marines are trained to do when facing an enemy: gather intelligence, identify targets, and execute a mission with the precision and determination that had once made him invaluable to his country. The war for Emily's justice was about to begin, and Daniel Chen was going to fight it with every skill he had learned in Afghanistan, and every ounce of love he felt for the broken girl who lay breathing only because machines were doing it for her. If the system wouldn't protect his daughter, then he would tear that system down and build something better from its ashes. The privileged children who had destroyed Emily's life were about to learn what happened when they picked a fight with someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The first phase of Daniel's campaign began with reconnaissance, a skill he had perfected during his years in the Marines and one that translated surprisingly well to the world of suburban corruption. While Emily lay motionless in her hospital bed, surrounded by machines that painted her vital signs in green lines across black screens, her father transformed himself into something the school's administration had never encountered. A working-class parent with military training and absolutely nothing to lose. Daniel started by studying the enemy's terrain. Westfield Academy had been built on a foundation of old money and newer wealth, its board of trustees reading like a who's who of regional power brokers. The Sinclair family owned significant commercial real estate throughout the city, their influence extending into city council meetings and zoning board decisions. The Hawthorns had built their pharmaceutical fortune on carefully maintained government contracts and relationships with regulatory agencies that ensured their products faced minimal scrutiny. The Walsh media empire controlled 3 major newspapers, 2 television stations, and enough digital influence to shape public opinion across the entire metropolitan area. Against this network of interconnected power and privilege stood a single construction worker with a high school education and a daughter in a coma. On paper, it wasn't even a fair fight. But Daniel had learned something in Afghanistan that his enemies had never needed to understand. When you're fighting for survival, when everything you love is at stake, you discover resources within yourself that you never knew existed. And sometimes, being underestimated is the greatest advantage of all. He began with the security footage that had so conveniently malfunctioned. During his lunch breaks, Daniel parked his truck across from the school and observed the campus with the patience of a sniper waiting for the perfect shot. He noted the camera positions, the sight lines, the areas where students gathered between classes. What he discovered was that Westfield Academy had one of the most comprehensive security systems he had ever seen, with cameras covering virtually every inch of the property. The idea that footage from such a system could simply disappear due to technical malfunction was insulting in its obviousness. Daniel spent his evenings at the local library, teaching himself about digital storage systems and security protocols, with the same methodical approach he had once used to master foreign languages and weapons systems. He researched the school's technology infrastructure, learning about their service providers and backup systems, building a comprehensive picture of how information flowed through the institution. What he found was that Westfield Academy's security system was managed by Morrison Tech Solutions, a company owned by the uncle of one of the students who had been present during Emily's assault. The connections were subtle but unmistakable to someone trained to see patterns where others saw coincidence. While he gathered intelligence on the school's systems, Daniel also began cultivating sources among the staff. He discovered that the custodial crew at Westfield Academy was largely composed of working-class immigrants who shared more in common with him than with the wealthy families they served. These men and women had been invisible to the school's elite for so long that they had become the perfect intelligence network. Maria Santos, the head of the evening cleaning crew, was the first to trust him with information. She'd been working at the school for 8 years, long enough to understand the unspoken rules that governed its operations. When Daniel approached her in the parking lot after visiting hours at the hospital, she initially seemed suspicious of his interest. "My daughter was the girl who was hurt," he explained simply. "Emily Chen, the one they're saying was in some kind of accident." Maria's expression changed immediately, her wariness replaced by something that looked like relief. "Ay, mijo," she whispered, glancing around to ensure they weren't being observed. "That girl, she was no accident. I seen what they did to her artwork, scattered all over that hallway like garbage. And the blood," she shuddered. "I've been cleaning that school for 8 years, and I never seen so much blood from any accident." "What else did you see, Maria?" She hesitated, clearly weighing the risks of speaking against the potential consequences of staying silent. Those cameras, they work just fine. I seen the security guards watching them every night, checking all the recordings before they file them away. But the morning after your Emily got hurt, they was in there with some computer people doing things to the system I never seen before. This was the confirmation Daniel had been hoping for, but he kept his expression neutral. Do you know which students were involved? Everyone knows, mijo. But knowing and saying, those are different things when you got bills to pay and kids to feed. Maria looked toward the school building, its windows glowing warmly in the autumn evening. That Sinclair girl, she run this place like she own it. And maybe she do, with her mama on the board and her daddy paying for half the new buildings. What about the teachers? Surely someone must have seen something. Maria's laugh was bitter. The teachers, they see what they can afford to see. You speak up about the wrong students here, you find yourself looking for a new job real quick. And jobs that pay as good as this one, they don't grow on trees. As their conversation continued, Daniel learned about the careful ecosystem of silence that protected Westfield Academy's most valuable students. Teachers who asked too many questions found themselves reassigned to less prestigious positions. Staff members who reported incidents involving influential families discovered that their contracts were not renewed. The message was clear: see nothing, hear nothing, say nothing, and everyone could continue their comfortable existence. But Maria also told him about the growing discontent among the faculty, particularly among the younger teachers who hadn't yet learned to compromise their principles for job security. Mrs. Rodriguez, Emily's art teacher, had been asking questions that made the administration uncomfortable. Several other teachers had expressed private concerns about the incident, though none had been willing to speak officially. You want to know the truth about what happened to your girl, Maria said as their conversation drew to a close. You need to talk to the night security guard, Carlos Mendez. He been here longer than anybody, and he got copies of things that other people might want to disappear. Daniel thanked Maria and began planning his approach to Carlos. But as he drove home through the darkened streets, his mind was already working on the larger strategic picture. He was building a network of sources, gathering intelligence about his enemy's weaknesses, identifying pressure points that could be exploited when the time came for action. The next phase of his investigation focused on the students themselves. Daniel understood that teenagers, no matter how wealthy or sophisticated, were still essentially children. They made mistakes, left digital trails, and often failed to understand the long-term consequences of their actions. If the adults were being careful to cover their tracks, the students might be less cautious. He began by studying their social media presence, spending late nights scrolling through Instagram posts and Twitter feeds that revealed the casual cruelty and entitled worldview of Westfield Academy's elite. Madison Sinclair's accounts were particularly revealing, filled with photos that showcased her expensive lifestyle and comments that demonstrated her complete lack of empathy for anyone she considered beneath her social status. But it was in the comment sections and private group chats that Daniel found what he was looking for. Several students had posted cryptic references to finally putting the scholarship girl in her place and teaching someone a lesson they wouldn't forget. The posts had been quickly deleted, but Daniel had learned enough about digital forensics to understand that nothing on the internet ever truly disappears. Using techniques he had taught himself through online courses and military contacts who had transitioned into cybersecurity, Daniel began building a comprehensive digital profile of everyone involved in Emily's assault. He tracked their movements through geo-tagged photos, their relationships through tagged posts and shared content, their activities through the digital breadcrumbs that modern teenagers leave behind without thinking. What emerged was a picture of a coordinated campaign of harassment that had been building for weeks before the physical assault. Emily had been systematically isolated, humiliated, and terrorized by a group of students who saw her very presence at their school as an insult to their inherited status. The attack in the hallway hadn't been a spontaneous outbreak of violence. It had been the planned culmination of a sustained campaign of psychological warfare. But Daniel's most significant breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Trevor Hawthorne's younger brother, Marcus. At 15, Marcus was still young enough to feel guilt about what he had witnessed, still naive enough to believe that the truth might actually matter. When Daniel found him at a coffee shop near the school, the boy was clearly struggling with what he had seen. "I know who you are," Marcus said when Daniel approached his table. "You're Emily's dad." "Yes, I am." Daniel sat down across from the teenager, studying his face for signs of deception or manipulation. What he saw instead was genuine distress, the kind of moral conflict that suggested this boy might still be saved from becoming like his older brother. "What they did to her." Marcus's voice broke slightly. "It wasn't right, man. I tried to tell Trevor to stop, but he wouldn't listen. None of them would listen." "Tell me what you saw, Marcus." The story that emerged was even worse than Daniel had imagined. The assault had been planned in advance, with specific roles assigned to different participants. Madison had orchestrated the psychological components, using her knowledge of Emily's insecurities to maximize the emotional damage. Trevor had coordinated the physical violence, ensuring that the attack would be severe enough to send a message, but still plausibly deniable as an accident. Jessica had managed the digital component, organizing the filming and ensuring that any evidence that might surface would be carefully controlled. "They made it sound like they were just going to scare her," Marcus said, tears now flowing freely down his face. "But when it started, it was like watching wolves attack a deer. She couldn't fight back, couldn't defend herself. And they just kept going, kept hitting her even after she was on the ground. Did you record any of this?" Marcus nodded miserably. Everyone was recording. It was like they wanted proof of what they'd done. But then, after the ambulance came, Madison's mom showed up with some lawyers, and suddenly everyone's phones were getting checked and cleaned. They said it was to protect everyone's privacy, but really they were making sure no evidence survived. This was the smoking gun Daniel had been searching for, confirmation that evidence had existed and had been systematically destroyed to protect the perpetrators. But more than that, Marcus represented something even more valuable, a witness with a conscience, someone from inside the circle of privilege who might be willing to testify to the truth. However, Daniel knew that one teenage witness, no matter how credible, wouldn't be enough to overcome the combined power of the families he was fighting. He needed more evidence, more sources, more pressure points that could be exploited to force the truth into the light. His opportunity came from an unexpected direction. Mrs. Rodriguez. The art teacher had been conducting her own investigation, driven by grief for her student and rage at the injustice being perpetrated by the school administration. When she reached out to Daniel through Maria Santos, it marked the beginning of an alliance that would prove crucial in the battles to come. They met at a small diner on the outskirts of town, far from the watchful eyes of the school community. Mrs. Rodriguez was younger than Daniel had expected, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of passionate idealism that had drawn her to teaching despite the profession's many challenges. But there was steel in her voice when she spoke about Emily and what had been done to her. "I've been teaching for 6 years, she said, stirring her coffee with unnecessary force. "I've seen bullying before, seen how cruel teenagers can be to each other. But what happened to Emily was different. It was calculated, systematic, and the way the school is handling it—" She shook her head in disgust. "I've been told to let the administration handle it and to avoid speculation that might damage the school's reputation. They're more concerned about protecting their image than getting justice for that sweet girl." Mrs. Rodriguez reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope, sliding it across the table to Daniel. "I managed to save some things before they could disappear. Photos of Emily's destroyed artwork, documentation of previous incidents that were buried, and something else that might interest you." Daniel opened the envelope carefully. his heart racing as he examined the contents. The photos showed Emily's paintings scattered across the hallway, torn and trampled with a viciousness that spoke to pure hatred. But it was the last item that made his blood run cold. A printed email chain between several teachers discussing concerns about Madison Sinclair's behavior dating back over 2 years. "She's done this before," Mrs. Rodriguez explained quietly. "Different victims, different methods, but always the same pattern. The school knows exactly what kind of person she is, but her mother's position on the board makes her untouchable. Until now." "Why are you doing this?" Daniel asked, studying the teacher's face. "You're risking your career." "Because Emily doesn't deserve what happened to her. Because I became a teacher to protect kids like her, not to enable their tormentors." Mrs. Rodriguez's voice hardened with resolve. "And because I have copies of everything. If they fire me, if they try to bury this, I'll make sure the whole world knows what kind of place Westfield Academy really is." This alliance marked a turning point in Daniel's campaign. He was no longer a lone parent fighting against an institution. He was building a coalition of people who had been pushed too far by a system that valued money over morality. But he also knew that his enemies wouldn't remain passive as he gathered strength. Soon they would begin to push back. The first sign of retaliation came within a week of his meeting with Mrs. Rodriguez. Daniel arrived at work to find his supervisor, Jim Patterson, waiting for him with an expression that mixed embarrassment with resignation. "Danny, we need to talk," Jim said, gesturing toward the construction trailer that served as the site office. "I got a call from the main office this morning. There are some concerns about your recent activities." Daniel felt his stomach tighten, but kept his expression neutral. "What kind of concerns?" "Look, I don't know the details, and frankly I don't want to know. But apparently some important people are saying you've been harassing their kids, making accusations you can't prove." Jim sat heavily behind his desk, avoiding Daniel's eyes. "The company can't afford to have that kind of heat right now. We're bidding on 3 major projects, and if the wrong people get upset with us..." "Are you firing me, Jim?" "I'm telling you to be careful. Take some time off. Let things cool down. We'll hold your position for now, but if this gets any bigger..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Daniel understood the message perfectly. His enemies were using their economic influence to isolate him, to cut off his resources and force him to choose between pursuing justice for Emily and maintaining his livelihood. It was a classic strategy, one that had probably worked countless times before against parents who couldn't afford to fight back, but they had miscalculated. Daniel had spent 15 years living below his means, saving money for Emily's future education and their shared dreams. He had military benefits that provided basic health care and skills that made him employable even without Jim Patterson's construction company. Most importantly, he had a daughter in a coma who needed him to be stronger than their enemies expected. "I understand," Daniel said simply, rising from his chair. "I'll take that time off. See you when things cool down." But instead of retreating, Daniel used his forced leave of absence to accelerate his investigation. With no work obligations to constrain his schedule, he threw himself into the mission with the single-minded focus that had once made him an exceptional Marine. His next target was the security footage that had so mysteriously disappeared. Carlos Mendez, the night security guard Maria had told him about, proved to be exactly the ally Daniel had hoped for. A former army sergeant who had served 2 tours in Iraq, Carlos understood the brotherhood that exists between veterans and the obligations that come with it. "They think I'm just another invisible brown face pushing buttons and watching screens," Carlos told Daniel as they sat in his security office during the small hours of the morning. "But I seen things, man. I seen how this place really works." Carlos had indeed seen the deletion of the security footage, had watched as technicians spent hours scrubbing the digital records clean. But what the technicians hadn't known was that Carlos had his own backup system, a personal insurance policy he had created after years of watching evidence disappear whenever it implicated the wrong students. "I got kids of my own," Carlos explained as he loaded a USB drive with recovered footage. "And I seen what happens to people who cross these families. But what they did to your little girl, that crosses a line even for them." The footage was devastating. Crystal clear video showed Madison Sinclair and her accomplices surrounding Emily in the hallway, showed the progression from verbal harassment to physical violence, captured every blow and every moment of Emily's desperate attempts to protect herself. But more than that, it showed the calculated nature of the assault, the way the attackers had positioned themselves to avoid the main security cameras while still being recorded by a backup system they hadn't known existed. Daniel copied the footage to multiple drives, storing them in different locations and ensuring that this evidence couldn't simply vanish like its predecessors. But he also knew that having the evidence was only the first step. He needed to find a way to force it into the public eye, to create enough pressure that even the combined influence of his enemies couldn't suppress the truth. The opportunity came from an unexpected source: social media activism. Daniel had never been particularly active on platforms like Twitter or Facebook, but he began to understand their power as tools for organizing and amplifying voices that traditional media might ignore. He created accounts dedicated to seeking justice for Emily, sharing carefully crafted posts that told her story without revealing the full extent of his evidence. The hashtag Justice for Emily began to gain traction, particularly among parents who recognized their own children in Emily's story. Daniel shared photos of his daughter's artwork, stories about her dreams and ambitions, painting a picture of the gentle soul who'd been destroyed by entitled cruelty. The contrast between Emily's obvious goodness and the violence that had been inflicted upon her created exactly the kind of emotional resonance that could cut through political affiliations and class divisions. But Daniel's most effective weapon was his own story. He wrote about being a single father, about working multiple jobs to give his daughter opportunities he had never had, about the dreams they had shared for her future. He wrote about visiting her in the hospital, about watching machines breathe for her while her attackers walked free. His posts had the authenticity that no public relations firm could manufacture, the raw emotional truth that resonated with anyone who had ever loved a child. The response was overwhelming. Parents, teachers, veterans, and ordinary citizens began sharing Emily's story, adding their own experiences with institutional cover-ups and systemic injustice. The hashtag spread beyond Daniel's initial posts, becoming a rallying cry for everyone who had ever felt powerless against entrenched privilege. Media attention followed. Local news stations, initially cautious about covering a story that implicated such influential families, began to feel pressure from their audiences to investigate the claims being made online. Regional newspapers picked up the story, and soon national outlets were sending reporters to dig into the corruption at Westfield Academy. Dr. Margaret Ashford called an emergency press conference, standing behind a podium in the school's elegant conference room as she attempted to control the narrative that was rapidly spiraling beyond her influence. "Westfield Academy has always been committed to the safety and well-being of all our students," she declared, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being believed without question. The recent allegations being spread on social media are based on incomplete information and represent a rush to judgment that serves no one's interests, particularly those of the students involved. But her carefully crafted statements couldn't compete with the raw footage that Daniel had begun strategically releasing. Short clips that showed the build-up to the attack appeared online, each one contradicting the school's narrative of an accidental altercation. The videos went viral, shared millions of times by viewers who couldn't believe that such brutal violence could be dismissed as a misunderstanding. The pressure intensified when Mrs. Rodriguez went public with her allegations, appearing on a local news program to discuss the culture of impunity that protected Westfield Academy's most violent students. Her credibility as an educator, combined with her obvious passion for justice, gave weight to accusations that the school administration had tried to dismiss as the fantasies of a grieving parent. Emily Chen was targeted because she represented everything these students couldn't understand or control, Mrs. Rodriguez said, looking directly into the camera. She was talented, authentic, and kind, qualities that threatened their worldview where worth is measured only by wealth and social status. The school knew what kind of students they were protecting, and they chose money over morality. As the story gained national attention, other victims began to come forward. Students who had transferred from Westfield Academy to escape similar harassment. Parents who had been intimidated into silence by threats of legal action. Teachers who had been forced to resign after refusing to ignore evidence of abuse. Each new testimony added another layer to the picture of systematic corruption that Daniel had been methodically exposing. The breaking point came when Marcus Hawthorne, overcome by guilt and pressure from his own conscience, decided to speak publicly about what he had witnessed. His testimony was particularly damaging because it came from inside the circle of privilege, from someone who had no apparent motive for lying and everything to lose by telling the truth. "I watched them plan it," he said in a video that his sister helped him record and upload to multiple platforms. Madison said Emily needed to learn her place, that scholarship kids shouldn't think they belonged at our school. Trevor talked about making an example of her. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they thought they could get away with it because they always had before. The video of Marcus's confession became the most shared content in the Justice for Emily campaign, viewed millions of times within hours of its upload. It represented something unprecedented, a member of the elite breaking ranks to support the powerless, a child of privilege choosing conscience over comfort. The response from the implicated families was swift and vicious. Marcus found himself cut off from his family's financial support, threatened with legal action, and subjected to a campaign of intimidation designed to force him to recant his testimony. But by then, the momentum had become unstoppable. Major news networks picked up the story, sending investigative teams to examine not just Emily's case, but the broader culture of corruption that protected wealthy students from consequences. The story had everything that made for compelling television: violence against an innocent victim, systemic injustice, a father's quest for justice, and the kind of class conflict that resonated with viewers across the political spectrum. Daniel found himself at the center of a media storm that he had carefully orchestrated but was no longer completely controlling. Interview requests poured in from across the country, offers of legal assistance came from high-profile attorneys, and donations began flowing into a legal fund that supporters had organized without his direct involvement. But even as the pressure mounted, Westfield Academy's Board of Trustees continued to resist calls for accountability. They hired expensive public relations firms to manage the crisis, brought in crisis management consultants to develop strategies for weathering the storm, and used their media connections to plant stories that questioned Daniel's motives and mental state. The counterattack was predictable but vicious. Stories appeared suggesting that Daniel was exploiting his daughter's tragedy for personal gain, that his military service had left him unstable and prone to paranoid fantasies, that his working-class background made him inherently resentful of successful families. The attacks were carefully crafted to avoid obvious falsehoods while still undermining his credibility and painting him as an unreliable narrator of his own story. If you're following this story and feeling that anger rising in your chest, that sense of injustice that demands action, then you understand what Daniel was experiencing every single day. Comment below and let me know what you think should happen to these corrupt administrators. And make sure you stay until the end, because what Daniel does next will restore your faith in the power of one person to change everything. But Daniel had prepared for this phase of the battle. His military training had taught him to anticipate enemy responses and plan accordingly. Instead of responding defensively to the personal attacks, he used them as opportunities to refocus attention on the evidence he had gathered and the victims who deserved justice. When critics questioned his motives, Daniel released financial records showing that he had refused all offers of monetary compensation and was using his own savings to fund the legal battle. When they attacked his credibility, he presented additional evidence that corroborated every claim he had made. When they suggested he was mentally unstable, veterans organizations rallied to his defense, highlighting his exemplary service record and the injustice of using his military service against him. The tide began to turn when the FBI announced that they were opening a federal investigation into civil rights violations at Westfield Academy. The involvement of federal law enforcement changed the entire dynamic of the conflict, shifting it from a local scandal to a national case with implications that extended far beyond Emily's individual situation. The federal investigation revealed the true scope of the corruption that Daniel had been fighting. Bank records showed suspicious financial relationships between school board members and the families of violent students. Email communications revealed systematic efforts to suppress evidence and intimidate witnesses. Phone records documented coordination between school administrators and local law enforcement to minimize consequences for wealthy students. But the most damaging revelation came from the investigation of the school's technology systems. Federal agents recovered not just the footage of Emily's assault, but evidence of dozens of other incidents that had been systematically covered up over the years. The pattern was unmistakable. Westfield Academy had become a place where money could buy immunity from consequences, where violence was acceptable as long as it was perpetrated by the right families. The arrests began on a cold December morning, exactly 2 months after Emily had been attacked. FBI agents arrived at Westfield Academy with search warrants and handcuffs, taking into custody 3 students who were charged with federal hate crimes and conspiracy to violate civil rights. The sight of Madison Sinclair, Trevor Hawthorne, and Jessica Walsh being led away in handcuffs was broadcast live on national television, marking the end of their reign of terror and the beginning of a new chapter in the fight for justice. But Daniel's victory extended far beyond the criminal charges against Emily's attackers. The federal investigation had exposed corruption that reached into every level of the school's administration, leading to arrests of key administrators and board members who had enabled the violence through their systematic cover-ups. Dr. Margaret Ashford was among those arrested, charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy to violate federal civil rights laws. Her perp walk, captured by dozens of cameras as she was led from her elegant office to a waiting police car, became an iconic image of the consequences that await those who believe their wealth and position place them above the law. The investigation also revealed the broader network of corruption that had protected the school's most violent students. Local police officials who had participated in cover-ups found themselves facing federal charges. City officials who had used their influence to protect the school faced corruption investigations. The web of complicity that had seemed so impenetrable just months earlier was systematically dismantled by federal prosecutors who couldn't be intimidated or bought. As winter turned to spring, Emily began to show signs of improvement. The doctors couldn't say whether she would make a full recovery, couldn't predict what lasting effects her injuries might have, but she was breathing on her own again, responding to voices and touch, slowly fighting her way back from the darkness that had claimed her for so many months. Daniel was there when she first opened her eyes, when she first spoke his name, in a voice that was weak but unmistakably his daughter's. The moment was captured by a hospital photographer and later shared with Emily's permission, becoming one of the most powerful images in a story that had captivated the nation. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, but carrying all the love and trust that had defined their relationship. "I'm here, sweetheart," he replied, taking her hand in his as tears streamed down his face. "I'm here, and I'm never going anywhere." The criminal trials that followed were closely watched by media outlets around the world. Madison Sinclair, Trevor Hawthorne, and Jessica Walsh were each convicted on multiple federal charges and sentenced to significant prison terms that sent a clear message about the consequences of hate-motivated violence. Their parents, who had spent fortunes trying to protect their children from consequences, found themselves facing their own legal challenges as the full scope of their involvement in the cover-up was revealed. But Daniel's victory extended far beyond individual prosecutions. The case had exposed systemic problems that demanded systematic solutions. Westfield Academy was placed under federal oversight, its entire administration replaced and its policies completely restructured. New laws were passed requiring transparency in how schools handle violence and bullying, making it much harder for institutions to bury inconvenient truths. The Justice for Emily movement evolved into something larger, becoming a nationwide organization that supported families fighting similar battles against institutional corruption and systematic injustice. Daniel found himself speaking at conferences and congressional hearings, sharing his story and advocating for reforms that would protect other children from experiencing what Emily had endured. Most importantly, Emily herself became a powerful voice for change. As she recovered from her injuries, she used her platform to speak about the importance of standing up for those who cannot defend themselves, about the responsibility that comes with privilege, and about the power of art and beauty to heal wounds that seem impossibly deep. Her paintings, many of them created during her long recovery, became symbols of resilience and hope. Museums competed to display her work, with proceeds from sales going to support anti-bullying programs and legal assistance for families fighting similar battles. The girl who had once been invisible to her wealthy classmates became internationally recognized as an artist and activist whose work spoke to universal themes of justice and redemption. The empty hallways of Westfield Academy, once filled with the laughter of entitled children who believed themselves untouchable, now echoed with different voices. New students arrived from diverse backgrounds, their talents valued over their trust funds, their character measured by their actions rather than their ancestry. The school that had once been a monument to privilege became a model for educational excellence that served all students equally. Daniel often walked those same hallways now, visiting as a member of the school's Reform Board of Trustees. Where Emily had once been beaten unconscious, there now stood a scholarship fund, named in her honor, supporting students whose talent and determination deserved recognition regardless of their economic circumstances. On the wall near the art studio hung one of Emily's paintings, a landscape that seemed to capture both the darkness of what had happened and the light of what had emerged from it. Students stopped to study the work, many of them unaware of the full story behind it, but somehow understanding that it represented something important about justice, redemption, and the power of truth to transform even the most corrupt institutions. The transformation extended beyond Westfield Academy to the community that had once enabled its corruption. City officials who had traded favors for political support found themselves facing unprecedented scrutiny from voters who had learned not to trust appearances or accept comfortable lies. Police departments implemented new training programs focused on recognizing and preventing civil rights violations. Local media outlets, chastened by their initial failure to investigate obvious corruption, established new standards for holding powerful interests accountable. Daniel's story became a case study taught in journalism schools, military academies, and law schools across the country. It demonstrated how one person with determination and moral clarity could expose systematic corruption and create lasting change. But more than that, it showed how the skills learned in service to one's country could be transformed into service to one's community, how the warrior's ethos could be channeled into the protector's mission. The construction company that had pressured Daniel to back down from his fight eventually offered him his job back, along with a promotion and a public apology. He declined the offer, having discovered that his true calling lay in advocacy and reform, rather than building structures with steel and concrete. The foundations he was laying now were more important than any building he had ever constructed. Emily returned to school, but not to Westfield Academy. She chose instead a public high school where her talent was recognized and nurtured without regard to her family's financial status. Her art continued to evolve, developing a maturity and depth that spoke to experiences most teenagers could never imagine. College recruitment letters poured in from prestigious institutions around the country, many offering full scholarships that recognized both her artistic ability and her courage in the face of adversity. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source: Marcus Hawthorne, the boy whose conscience had helped break open the case. He had paid a heavy price for his honesty, losing his family's support and facing years of therapy to overcome the trauma of witnessing violence and choosing truth over comfort. When he approached Emily at a public event months after the trials had ended, the conversation between them was private, but observers noted the tears in both their eyes and the handshake that seemed to represent something larger than personal forgiveness. The anniversary of Emily's assault became an annual day of recognition for anti-bullying advocates and victims' rights organizations. Schools across the country observed moments of silence, not just for Emily, but for all the children whose suffering had been hidden by powerful interests and institutional indifference. The day served as a reminder that vigilance is the price of justice, that progress requires constant effort, and that the most vulnerable members of society depend on others to speak for them when they cannot speak for themselves. Daniel's transformation from grieving father to national advocate had been complete, but it had not come without cost. The years of fighting had aged him, left him with scars both visible and hidden. He had learned things about human nature and institutional corruption that could never be unlearned, had seen depths of cruelty that would forever change his understanding of the world. But he had also discovered reserves of strength and purpose that he had never known he possessed. The quiet construction worker who had once believed that keeping his head down and working hard would be enough to protect his daughter had become a voice for every parent who had ever felt powerless against systems designed to protect the wealthy and privileged. His speeches at conferences and congressional hearings carried the authority of someone who had faced the worst that institutional corruption could offer and emerged victorious. He spoke about the importance of evidence over influence, about the power of persistence in the face of overwhelming opposition, about the responsibility that comes with privilege and the consequences that must follow when that responsibility is betrayed. As Emily prepared for graduation and looked forward to college, she often reflected on the journey that had brought her family to this point. The shy girl, who had once moved through Westfield Academy's hallways like a ghost, had become a voice for justice that resonated around the world. Her artwork now hung in galleries and museums, but more importantly, her story had become part of a larger narrative about the power of truth to overcome even the most entrenched corruption. The case files from the FBI investigation eventually filled dozens of boxes, documenting not just the crimes that had been committed, but the systematic reforms that had been implemented to prevent their repetition. New federal guidelines required transparency in how schools handle reports of violence. Training programs for administrators and teachers emphasized the legal and moral obligations that come with positions of authority over children. Oversight mechanisms were established to ensure that wealthy families could no longer simply buy their children's way out of consequences for serious crimes. But perhaps the most important change was less tangible but more profound: the understanding that ordinary people possess extraordinary power when they refuse to accept injustice. Daniel's story became proof that the system, no matter how corrupt or entrenched, could not withstand the determined opposition of citizens who demanded better for their children and their communities. The media attention eventually faded, as media attention always does. New scandals and crises captured public attention, and the daily struggle for justice moved on to other battles in other places. But the changes that Daniel and Emily's story had catalyzed continued to ripple outward, touching lives and transforming institutions in ways that would have seemed impossible on that terrible October afternoon, when a gentle girl was beaten into a coma by students who believed themselves untouchable. If this story has moved you, if you believe that justice delayed is not justice denied, then subscribe to this channel for more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when the stakes are highest. Because Emily's story is not just about one family's fight for justice. It's about the responsibility we all share to protect the vulnerable and hold the powerful accountable. It's about the truth that no amount of money or influence can ultimately overcome the determination of people who refuse to accept that might makes right. In the end, Daniel Chen had done more than seek justice for his daughter. He had proved that the powerful are only as strong as the silence of those they oppress, that corruption can only survive in darkness, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by armies or governments, but by ordinary people who find within themselves the courage to stand up and say enough. Emily's paintings now hang in the reformed hallways of Westfield Academy, but they also hang in homes around the world, bought by people who wanted to own a piece of a story that reminded them of the best possibilities of human nature. Each purchase supported scholarships for deserving students, continuing the cycle of opportunity and justice that had emerged from tragedy. The scholarship students who now walked the halls where Emily had once been brutalized carried with them the knowledge that their presence was not charity, but justice, not privilege, but right. They studied in classrooms where merit mattered more than money, where character counted more than connections, where the accident of birth was no longer a predictor of worth. And in a hospital room, where machines had once breathed for a broken girl, visitors now found only empty space and lingering hope. Emily had walked out of that room under her own power, her hand in her father's, ready to face a future that was brighter because of the darkness they had survived together. The war Daniel Chen had fought was over, but the peace he had won would last for generations. In classrooms and courtrooms, in board meetings and legislative hearings, in the quiet moments when powerful people faced decisions about how to use their influence, Emily's story served as a reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, is never truly defeated as long as there are people willing to fight for it. The gentle girl who had painted landscapes of hope had become a landscape herself, a permanent feature of the moral terrain that future generations would inherit. Her father, the quiet construction worker who had built something more important than any building, had proved that the most solid foundations are not made of steel and concrete, but of love and courage, and the unshakable belief that every child deserves protection from those who would do them harm. Their story was complete, but it was also just beginning, as every true story of justice must be, not an ending but a beginning, not a conclusion but a foundation upon which others could build something even better for the children who would come after. This had been Emily's victory, Daniel's triumph, and America's promise kept, that in the end, truth would prevail. Justice would be served, and no child would suffer in silence, while those who claimed to protect them chose money over morality, influence over integrity, privilege over the basic human dignity that belongs to every person regardless of their family's place in the world. The construction worker's daughter had taught the nation what it truly meant to build something that would last.